Good evening. It's good to be here. Aunt Carly wanted me to start off by saying, that's Carly over there, so wave, so that they'll know that this is your idea of overcoming your anxiety by coming to a conference or conversation on anxiety. I think that was pretty cool. I first started to think about this and work on it more carefully for two reasons. One, my oldest son was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and panic attacks and things of that nature centering around that really started to surface after his first marriage, ended up resulting in the end of that marriage. So that started me thinking, what is this about? So that was one aspect. The second was, as John mentioned, I teach at Vanguard, and so my primary kind of population is 18 to 22-year-olds, and I was getting more and more conversations with students. I do a lot of walking with kids on campus, and I was getting more and more conversations centering around the same cluster of symptoms, so what's that about, and how do we think through that from a discipling standpoint? They were talking with the counseling center. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a pastor. That's my training. So I come at this conversation from within that framework. And so I was often then walking in partnership with our on-campus counseling environment while doing soul care and pastoral care with students, and seeing, obviously there's an overlap, right? We're living souls, so there's not a part of us that is one thing and a part of us that is spiritual. We're all of a whole, so the partnership really is important. And then it occurred to me that I had at that point, probably over 30 years, been married to a woman who had, in one form or another, been battling clinical depression since the birth of our third child. And my research at that point had indicated that there is a fairly close connection between anxiety disorders of various kinds and clinical depression. And often centering around trauma in childhood and genetic predisposition, family system, family origin, that kind of stuff. And then my youngest son started to, at 12 or 13, exhibit some indications of anxiety. And because his older brother, who was 11 years older than him, had by that time we'd finally figured out what was going on there, we started to take Peter's issues a little bit more seriously, and got him in to talk to somebody who was really very, very helpful to him, and really enabled him to head off a lot of the stuff that tanked his brother later on. So my primary claim to fame in talking about this is that I'm a carrier. Everybody around me is either anxious or depressed, or angry. That's my middle son. So that they tend to go together. Me, I'm fine. That's not wrong with me at all. But like John said, this is a topic that bears conversation in the church, I think. I need you to kind of sit with me in this for a little bit, because we will come at these kinds of issues wanting to fix them and to fix the people that have them. And Jesus can do that, but more often than not, he wants us to learn how to be disciples with the reality of our own souls. So the question is not, how do I get over this? It's how can I be a faithful disciple of Jesus with this? What would Jesus be like if he had an anxiety disorder? How would he manage? And that sounds almost ridiculous. Will he just heal himself? No. He entered fully into all of the stuff that we go through, right? He was tempted in every way that we are. and he never lost sight of who he was. So how do we learn to be followers and disciples of Jesus within this framework on the way to becoming a non-anxious presence, which is really kind of the goal that we're after here. And so tonight we'll talk about where this might come from, and my hope is that there will be a free-flowing conversation. To the degree that you want to ask questions or push in or make comments from within your own framework, that's fine. So tonight we'll talk kind of definition, what it is, where it comes from at the root level, and then where it might come from also at the individual level, family system stuff. Next week we'll talk more specifically about what the Bible says. So what does Jesus say about anxiety, and what does Paul say about anxiety? We'll talk about that a little more explicitly, and then the following week we'll talk about, okay, now what? How do we live if we're not healed of this? How do we live with it in a way that moves us towards discipleship and helps us to become more able to fully function as disciples of Jesus? So that's kind of the agenda for the next 3 weeks. And like I said, it's really interesting, because usually when I'm at the garden, all of you people are in the dark. So this is kind of fun to see your faces. So definition, you see it there. It's just a classic kind of almost dictionary definition: a feeling of worry, nervousness, unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. And it would be fair to say that definition is a good starting point, but probably not a good ending point. It's entirely natural to be a little on edge about uncertainties into the future until we learn to be solid enough to recognize that we will be competent for whatever happens. That takes a fair long time. For most of us. A lot of the reason that we want the will of God, for example, is to protect us from anything bad happening to us. We think mistakenly that if we know what God's will is in a particular situation and follow that path, it will be the path of greatest ease, and that we won't run into difficulties or problems or whatever, and that if, in fact, we do run into difficulties and problems, it must be because we missed it somewhere. And inevitably the question is, why me? What did I do wrong? How did I get this sideways? And of course, all you got to do is think about it for about 10 seconds, and you realize that the one man on the planet who was in the center of God's will his whole life had bad things happen to him, had people hate him, had friends betray him, and ultimately died the most horrific death imaginable, right in the center of God's will. So knowing God's will protects you from nothing, right? And it's an important thing that we kind of get that into our heads, because a lot of our spiritual control structures are really about our fear and insecurity that we're not going to be adequate for what life brings us. I'm walking with a guy right now, and he and his girlfriend have been dating for almost 5 years. He's terrified to ask her to marry him. She has already all but bought the ring herself to signify that when you ask, we're in. Let's not mess around with this. So and finally the other day I don't know if I can be a good husband. I don't know if I'm competent for my life, is the short answer. Well, okay, that makes sense. Sort of. How do you ever intend to find out? We live, as I've said a couple times on Sundays, in the most anxious generation in the history of the world. And I want to talk about why that is a little bit. So that's the preliminary stuff to get us started. Any questions or comments or thoughts on that as we get going? Does that make sense? Okay, so in psychiatry, you see anxiety defined as a nervous disorder characterized by a state of excessive uneasiness, apprehension, also often regularly associated with compulsive behaviors and sometimes panic attacks. Sometimes that is triggered because there's two different things. One is a generalized anxiety that all of us have to a greater or lesser degree because we're human. We're uncertain about the future. We don't know what is going to happen. And so we have varying levels of anxiety. Where it crosses and becomes more of a disorder is where brain chemistry has been compromised to some degree as a result of childhood trauma or genetic predisposition. And trauma, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean physical. It could be that, but it could be the death of a loved one. My wife, for example, Dad died when she was 3. And there's no way in the world that a 3-year-old can process that catastrophic a loss. So, and her family was not very helpful in dealing with that. They were just trying to survive like everybody else. Her mom had 5 kids. So bang, she lost her dad, and then mom went to work, so she lost her mom. And what does a 3-year-old do? A 3-year-old disappears. They become a survivor. Their job is to get through the day. Do you see what I mean? So then that trauma at 3 years old, when the brain is still mushy, as it is until about 25, begins to make some imprints on how life actually is and how we process it. And that then, because of the way the brain operates with how it remembers things as a chemical and then a memory trace, et cetera, gets anchored and often then doesn't resurface until something triggers it down the line hormonally or some other trauma or something else that occurs. And for her, it happened to be the birth of our 3rd child. Postpartum depression lingered and then lingered and then lingered and then lingered and then lingered, and 15 years later, after 7 years of therapy and medication, normal was in sight, but it was a lot of work. Do you see? And to this day, the brain chemistry is still compromised. So the medication is an ongoing reality. You with me? So the range is fairly wide, right? The generalized anxiety that all of us feel at one time or another when we're heading into a job interview or meeting somebody new for the first time, or the in-laws for the first time, or that kind of stuff, or a friend that whatever it is, all the way to this full-blown, potentially brain compromised anxiety that regularly then is accompanied with panic attacks, which takes, what happens with panic attacks is that the brain processes, if it's weary or if it's gone through, if some of the other physical things, if it's not getting enough rest, if exercise is not part of the regimen, certain forms of diet, for example, a high caffeine diet or a high sweet diet, processed sugars diet, some people with white processed flour. It's not a gluten thing, but the way the body then processes all of this affects the brain chemistry, so it over-processes what it perceives to be a threat, right? And then it gets, because of, again, it doesn't have any regulator on it. So it moves quickly into full-blown adrenaline surge as if we're going to die, and we might die right now. And so the adrenaline starts. Am I getting this close to right, Lene? I've got a doctor sitting here, so you please tell me that I'm screwing this up. Everybody, But anyway, no. But it's the yeah. We're doing good. She'll correct me afterwards in private, right? Yeah. So anyway, so what happens is then that adrenaline starts to surge, and the body goes into panic mode. Nausea, flush, dry heaves, sometimes sweats, and all you can do with my oldest son, on the way to the airport, 105 freeway, and he's anxious about getting on the plane and flying to Hawaii. And he goes into a panic attack. We have to stop the car on the freeway, pull over to the left side of the thing. He has to get out of the car and lie down in the middle of the freeway. On the side, not in the middle of the freeway, the side. There were times when that would have been, no, but we'll not go there. And just wait for it to be over. And then what happens is once it's happened once, it creates this its own weather system. That what if I'm in public and it happens? What if I'm teaching and it happens? What if I'm performing? He's a worship leader and plays guitar. What if I'm? So now you see what happens is that the world just gets smaller and smaller and smaller because I want to avoid any and all possible places in which a panic attack would be embarrassing to me and those around me, and the world gets tinier. So that whole summer ended up being spent in the 900 square feet of their apartment. He could not leave it. It wasn't fear of open spaces, it was fear of having a panic attack at the post office. Do you see what I mean? And you can understand why a spouse might find that challenging, because that's not what I signed up for, right? And so that's kind of where the panic attack piece kicks into that. So that's good. Any questions so far? You doing good? All right. So anxiety results, I don't know how much I left on your pages, so let me just read this. Anxiety results from a failure to calibrate fear properly. Fear is one of the protector emotions, and it needs to be calibrated to reality. And because it is not calibrated to actual threats, it responds almost constantly and increasingly to what it perceives to be threats. Remember, perception is reality to the perceiver. So it does no good when somebody is anxious to tell them to smarten up, because they perceive threat, their body is starting to respond to that, and on we go. That body's response then tends to produce adrenaline, which tends to drive reaction response and can build up in the system over time. So everybody get what I'm after? We talked about emotions in the first soul care class way back a couple of years ago. You can go on the website, and I think you can listen to that if you want. The body has the soul, dirt, breath of God, two combined together, physical, spiritual. Those two in combination. So you have a body, but you're not body. You have a spirit, but you're not spirit, right? You're a soul, which is that unique combination of spirit and body, which is uniquely suited for what it means for us to be persons, created to be the image of God, right? So those two together, physical and spiritual, produce three subsidiary components: emotional, social, and intellectual. So social is how we relate to the world. Intellectual is how we process information. Emotion is how we process and register feelings, which are the primary thermometer of the soul. Physical is obviously what it is, and spiritual is our primary way of connection with God. So those are the five components. So in the center there, the way we process what happens to us is our emotions. And there are five core ones, depending on whose theories you're looking at. So just for my own sake, because I can remember five, we're at five. Two are what I think of as the fuel cell and the environment of the soul. So love is the environment within which the soul thrives. We are built to live in God, right? Who is love. So love is the environment within which the soul thrives. Joy is then the fuel of the soul's existence. It is what enables us to manage our lives. It's that inner pressure that keeps us from being crushed by the conforming pressures of the world around us, among other things, okay? So then God has given us 3 protector emotions that signal when things have gone awry. Sadness is a gift that signals loss and helps us to process loss. It's the most powerful of the 3 protector emotions. Grief is a gift that helps us to process loss. Often it is grief that goes internalized that produces anxiety. So sadness that is not properly processed, and by the way, processing sadness is really very easy. You feel sad until you don't feel sad anymore, and then you're done. Problem, we don't like to feel sad. So we try and get over it. And all that does is bury it deeper and make it last longer. Depending on how severe the loss is, grief lasts anywhere between 12 and 18 months at the extreme cases, right? Because you have to go, say somebody dies, right, that you loved, a parent or a child or a spouse or a friend or whatever it is. You have to go through all of the cycles of the anniversaries, the spots that we used to drive by. You see what I mean? And it usually takes about a year to 18 months to get all of those done. And all you got to do with grief is feel what you feel when you feel it, and don't feel what you don't feel when you don't feel it. In other words, it will tell you when we're done. But the more we resist it, the push it and the bury it, and sometimes, by the way, grief is how we process the loss of a friendship, the loss of a home. We move, right? The loss of, I've got a bunch of kids who are graduating in December, and I've already started to walk with them, a number of them who are kind of, is there life after college? I don't want, this is the safest place I've ever known. These are all my friends. Where does this go? Okay, it's okay to feel sad. It'd kind of actually be sad if you didn't feel sad. To have spent 4 years here and to be able to walk out the door and not let it hit you on the rear end as you walked out, wouldn't that be kind of sad? So joy helps us to process sadness with hope. You see? So sad. Then anger is a gift that helps us to process boundary violations. Each of those 5 aspects, physical, social, intellectual, spiritual, has a boundary. And if that's violated, if somebody touches you inappropriately or speaks to you inappropriately or dismisses you at a social setting or undermines your intelligence or whatever it is, or disregards your feelings, then anger is the way the body lets you know that there has been an incursion. Somebody has crossed the line they ought not to have crossed, and then helps you to quickly determine whether it's life-threatening. And if it is, then that's where the adrenaline kicks in and away we go. And most of it isn't life-threatening. So anger is the red light on the dashboard that you address by determining what was the boundary violation and how does love and joy now respond to that. I don't have to react to it. Most of us, however, have trained our bodies in reaction so that anger is 0 to 60 so fast that we don't think about it. So as we follow Jesus long enough, he trains us in how to be angry appropriately. It's one of the core gifts of the spiritual discipline. So, anger, and then the final one that we want to talk for just a minute about is fear, which signals a threat. And it helps us then to identify the threat and to process it appropriately. So what we want to do is make sure that the threat we perceive and the feeling of fear that we have are calibrated to one another. So that if it's a threat of an incoming missile, that ought to generate a level of fear appropriate to the threat. If it's somebody cutting me off on the freeway, anger and fear will play a game in which I have to determine whether he intends to kill me or not, and whether I'm in any real danger. Do you see what I mean? So fear helps us to identify and then process real and perceived threats. So when fear is not properly calibrated, it now produces this constant state of anxiety because we're afraid all the time. And then the hyper-control structures that we put in to mitigate our fear, which then only proves that we have no control over anything ever, contributes, and on and on we go. Questions on that? I just kind of push the button and I keep going, so stop me if you need. Shoot. Yeah. So if the sadness, and it will usually become debilitating in one of two cases. Either if we don't deal with it appropriately the first time around, right? Because grief, most powerful of the emotions, will if it's denied, work itself into the system and will be a grieving system for years. So that's one time. And then something completely unrelated and minor, a year from now, 5 years from now, will trigger the old grief, and it pushes. Sometimes the grief is so severe that it either triggers or causes some brain chemistry issues. The trauma, the brain responds to the loss, and then medication probably, and psychological counseling. Most psychologists won't counsel until they make sure that the brain chemistry can actually receive the counsel. Because counseling doesn't help if the brain chemistry is compromised. It just makes it worse, actually, because you're trying to get some traction and all you're doing, your feet are spinning on the ice. So, yeah. How do you determine that? Usually with help. That's why we're built to work in community. So if somebody who loves you and cares for you says, you've been sad for a really long time, or if, what color is the world to you? Are the colors bright and sharp, or are they muted and grayed and so on? Have you lost your appetite? Do things that once mattered to you not matter to you anymore? So then those are just very, very basic, but that then gets me starting to chase the rabbit and say, you need to go talk to somebody. And then the psychologist will often have a battery of questions. And if medication is indicated, then a psychiatrist tends to get involved. And by the way, let me just say this right out loud. You can probably tell this already, but there's no shame in getting drugs to help with chemical issues in the brain any more than there is shame in getting insulin to help with diabetes. Mental illness needs to be treated as an illness. It needs to be treated seriously. And if Prozac helps, for God's sake, take Prozac and give thanks that somebody invented that sucker. I am married today because of Prozac, right? So do you see what I mean? So at the same time, you want to walk with a psychiatrist who can actually, increasingly now they're doing some DNA testing so that we don't have to find 83 different ways, because when Jude was first starting on it, it was like 6 weeks in, does it work? Not so much. 6 weeks out, 6 weeks in and a new one, does it work? Not so much. 6 weeks out. And now the DNA testing helps to nail it down pretty quickly. And the goal, again, is not to be on medication the rest of your life. The goal is to get the brain working properly so counseling can actually help so you can come off medication. And less, yeah, that's good enough for that. Any questions? Anybody else? Hey. And we've talked about the adrenaline getting broken thing, so I'll just talk about that. Is there one over there? Okay, cool. No worries. A couple of things. You see, I think I've got it down there that regret is anxiety looking backwards, and worry is anxiety looking forwards. So if we're anxious about something that happened in the past, so it shows up in dreams or nightmares, we relive certain conversations, and regret is the primary thing. That's anxiety looking backwards. If, as we think about the future, getting married or having children or buying a house or starting a new job or whatever, that is anxiety. That's worry. That's anxiety about things yet to come into the future as a general frame of thinking about it. A certain amount of both of those can actually be very helpful. So as I look back on some situations and circumstances, if I have enough regret to not have those conversations or to not say those things again, that can be really helpful. If I look forward and have enough worry to plan ahead, to think a little bit more carefully about how we're going to get from here to wherever it is that we're going on vacation, then I'm probably, that can be helpful. But you can see how quickly both of those can become debilitating, where the worry about things in the future now becomes hyper-control over every possible element, and we have a printed schedule of where we have to be when, and in the Grand Canyon is we're 3 minutes late, we just have to leave because we're going to miss the hotel in Flagstaff. We got to be there at 6:02, and away we go. That's obviously not very helpful. I will say again, thinking about and planning for the future is not necessarily the mark of worry or fear or anxiety. Anxiety has more of an inner condition that moves towards that tension and fear as we've defined it. Okay, so the word anxiety, and I'm going to define this a little bit, our English word comes from the Latin. I've used this before in a sermon or two, and you probably have no recollection of it at all. I know when I preach that nothing ever sticks. So it comes from the Latin, and it roots at the time of the Colosseums. So where they would regularly tie a criminal, a slave or whatever, to 4 different animals in the Colosseum and send those animals off in 4 different directions that would then, for the entertainment of the crowd, tear the person apart. That's the root of the word anxiety. That action, and it is it's this internal argument, internal tension as we're trying to head in. So what causes anxiety is looking in 2 different directions at once. It's instead of having a priority, having multiple priorities. So we have multiple directions into which we are heading. And so, for example, as we look into the future and think about what it might look like, we discover there are multiple ways that this situation might unfold. And then we get fearful as if all of them could occur. But only one of them is going to happen. But we act in the moment as if all of them will happen. That's anxiety. You see? Because if it's 1, then we can plan for that. If it's 18, we can't plan for that. Do you see what I mean? This is rooted in our Genesis 3 reality, where according to Genesis 1 and 2, we are built for dependent relationship with God and interdependent relationships with each other. That dependent relationship on God anchors us without anxiety then in interdependent relationships with each other. You with me? So because I trust God, I can choose to trust you. It is that kind of, and you'll notice how the New Testament picks this up, right? And we pushed through on that. In Genesis 3, we decided to disconnect our dependent relationship with God by disobedience. Remember, don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the day that you eat thereof, you will die. You will disintegrate. Okay? So we eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and what begins to happen? The first casualty is our interdependence with one another. We know that we are naked, known, and instead of the no shame knowing, coming out of chapter 2, now there's shame in being known. And so we hide. We hide from one another. And that hiding then leads to fear, which means then we hide from God. And that fear often then leads to blame, which means we are ending up hiding from ourselves. Because blame diverts responsibility for what has happened to somebody else. I don't know who is responsible, but it's either you or the woman that you gave me. That's the end of chapter 3 in Genesis, right? So when we sit with this, please notice what the temptation was. Don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You're not built for duplicitous knowledge. You're not built to hold these two oppositional forces in tension. You're not built for that. You're in an environment of unmitigated good. You're built for that. Over time, you will mature and develop and then be able to manage the knowledge of good and evil. But right now, you're not ready for it. So don't eat the fruit of that tree. And that was the mark of dependent obedience. With me? So did you see what the temptation was? I want to know two things at once. No, really, I can hold it together. No, really, I can hold it together. I can manage to be like God, having knowledge, existential, experiential knowledge of good and evil. I can do that. And then we discovered that, in fact, we couldn't do it, and we disintegrate. We're pulled apart. So the roots of anxiety go right back to Genesis 3 and the decision we made to engage in and possess knowledge that we were not yet mature enough to have and manage. Remember and by the way, please notice what I'm doing here. It's not that God is saying, never eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He's saying, not now. You're not ready for it yet. The Orthodox Church, the Eastern Church, indicates that the humanity was not born into an adult, mature state. It was born into an immature, young adult state, and it needed to learn into capacity for that knowledge in order to be useful as the image of God. And I think that's a helpful way to think about that. We can only learn to manage the tensions between two competing options when we have determined the one tension that brings everything else into order. Okay? So, is that making sense? Okay? Because that's the root, I'm going to argue, that's the root of all of the anxieties that we deal with in core things. This is Jesus going to say, for example, you can't, and we'll talk about this next week, but you can't love God and mammon. You're going to love the one, hate the other, or love the one and hate the other. You're not built for this. So what are you to do? Seek first God and His kingdom. Have a priority. One. Have you noticed that, I think I mentioned this too, that the word priority only became pluralized 100 years ago? Let's think about what that means. If you have priorities, you don't. Do you see? We're not built for multitasking. Not even women are built for multitasking, right? We can only do one thing at a time, and the more we try and do at a time, the brain has to switch back and forth between the things that it's doing. That's why you can drive a car without paying attention, which is both gift and curse, right? Because I don't want to have to be thinking when I'm driving the car. Life happens way too fast to have to think about every action, but I don't want to drive a car without thinking. Otherwise, you get on the freeway and you realize, oh, how did I get here? I hope I didn't kill anybody. I kind of dozed off there, So anyway, so anxiety then is rooted to a greater or lesser degree in that original disintegration. And please notice, that disintegration then damages our relationships with others. It damages our relationship with God, and it damages our relationship with ourselves, and it pulls us apart. So we recognize that core anxiety, that core pulling apart reality, is rooted in a lie, and the lie is that God is not good. That's the lie. That's the original temptation for even the rest of us, and the one that we still deal with most often. Every time I hear somebody say, I'm not sure I can trust God, they're saying, I'm not sure God's good. Right? And we just need to own that, because that's going to continue to be the wolf that chases us down in the middle of the night. Right? Think about how that works itself out when life happens, and our immediate conclusion is God isn't good. You know how it works, right? Somebody near us dies, we get laid off, we get a terminal diagnosis, or even a troubling diagnosis, or we suffer financial setback, and then we get angry at God because He could have stopped it. And then it's a short bus stop from there to thinking, well, He's not good after all. He's not for me after all. Just you see how that works? And so that lie, that misunderstanding regarding finances, regarding sexuality, regarding human relationships, regarding identity, regarding everything. God is not good. We have to find a way to do an end run around God somehow. And that's what produces ultimately anxiety. And that's, I think, the Genesis 3 thing. And then one of the other elements that fits into this is a bridge into the personal roots of anxiety. And it's a bridge that is, I think, a lot of our anxiety sources from FOMO. Familiar with that? FOMO is fear of missing out. Right? Fear of missing out. That's the Genesis 3 root of anxiety. The belief that something is happening somewhere in the universe and I didn't get invited. You think about this, for example, with the social media context or with the texting generation. Kids don't want to email anymore, and they don't want to talk on the phone anymore. If you look at the 18 to 22-year-olds that I walk with, they rarely ever talk on their phones. But they can text like nobody's business. They will talk to the text, and it will convert it but they won't talk to the person. And the reason is that texting gives them just a hiccup of a moment that they don't have to respond in real time to the person on the other end of the phone. It puts me back in control of the timing of our interaction. Oh, I didn't get your text. That's why I didn't respond. Wink, wink, nod, nod. We all know what that means. You were actually waiting for somebody more popular to ask you to lunch. Or whatever. And this FOMO business is massive, and it's rooted in Genesis 3. And we believe that God's holding something back. And so we're gonna show Him. We're gonna rip the tablecloth off the tree at Christmas, and they're ha ha. And then we discover, no, He actually knew what He was talking about. Right? God's pretty smart that way. Okay, that's the kind of the universal root. How are we doing? Any questions, comments on that before we start to talk about then individual stuff in family systems?
Just to make sure I got it, so the misunderstanding that Adam and Eve had was that God was not good because he kept the tree.
Yeah. He was trying to keep something from us that we could manage and deserve. You'll notice that the language that's used is really instructive. She saw that the tree was beautiful, that it was good for food, which, by the way, it was. It was described that way in Genesis 2. But then the addition was, it was desirable to make wise. Oh, okay. That pushes it over the edge. Yeah. And by the way, let's be clear. It wasn't Adam and Eve. It was us. That is our story. That's not about somebody else long ago and far away. That's our story. It would not have gone down any differently had you been there. Because you were there, and this is what happened. That's why that story's there. That's how those stories work, right? In Genesis 1 through 12. Okay? So, you good? You want to take a break, or are you okay? Okay, we'll keep going? All right, because we'll look to go until about 8:30, and then if there's questions, we can look at that. So, personal roots of anxiety, how we learn and how we teach our children to be anxious. The first one is anxious family systems. So, family systems are intended to be built upon differentiation. Differentiation, in a nutshell, is leaving home, is becoming a whole person without primary reference to families of origin in those 5 dimensions: physical, spiritual, emotional, social, and intellectual. I become a whole person. This is also Genesis 2, right? For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother so that he has capacity to cleave to his wife, and they have capacity now to start a new one. Failure to cleave, failure to leave, failure to differentiate from one's family of origin produces a system that is almost inevitably going to be anxious. Why? Because you will be looking in 2 different directions at the same time. You'll be looking backward to the defining family of origin for your emotional cues, for your social cues, for your intellectual cues. What do I believe? What did my daddy believe? Like, okay, that's what I believe, right? And you will also be looking to your husband or wife for the new us and what our social, intellectual, mental cues are. Does that make sense? And of course, we're not built to look in 2 different directions at the same time. And so we end up with an anxious family system. And that tends to create a pattern of enmeshment. So failure to differentiate, failure to leave family, tends to produce an enmeshed relationship rather than a differentiated relationship. So we're built, husband and wife, each to leave families of origin, join together in an attractional magnetism, right? That we then re-separate. So because we don't want a marriage like this. We want a marriage like this that is free and has capacity for individual freedom and flourishing. This is Genesis 1. We can talk about that some other time if you want. And failure to do that, produces a marriage like this, creates an anxious system. Because now what happens when one of the persons vibrates? They both vibrate. And if they're each tied back to the family of origin, guess what happens out there at the edges? Now mom takes son's side against new wife, and that system starts to vibrate. Do you see? Now a third generation is added in. A son or a daughter is added into that, and that whole system trains that child in anxiety. Because the whole system it feels really wonderful. Because it feels close. If you were to ask somebody in an enmeshed family, describe your family, says, oh, we're so close, we're so close. Until one of them decides to choose or think differently than the rest of the system. Then you find out whether it's close or enmeshed. Because a close family will allow individual expression without anxiety. An enmeshed system will not. It will freak out. What do you mean you're a Republican? We're all Democrats in our family. Don't come home for Thanksgiving until you get your head screwed on right. Right? And take that gun rack out of the Prius. What's wrong with you? You know what I mean? And often, because differentiation has not occurred prior to marriage, guess who gets blamed? The new spouse who was brought into the system, because everything was fine before she married you. And I don't know how you die, and on it goes. So that, and by the way, leaving home is not about moving out of the house. It's about becoming a whole person without primary defining reference to families of origin in those 5 dimensions. I can still have my mom and dad call the shots on my emotional well-being even though they've been dead 25 years. Unless I've left home. Unless I've become an individuated person without reference. Do you see what I mean? So my language is I can't care what my mom and dad think. That enables me then to have an interdependent relationship, because the goal is not differentiation for independence. The goal is differentiation for interdependence. That's what we're built for, Genesis 1 and 2. So failure to do that produces an anxious system, which then produces anxious children who learn, and here's where the problem secondarily comes in, that they are the stabilizing force. Because the kids often become the bridge back to a dysfunctional family. You all of a sudden can do no wrong when you have a grandchild. You were an idiot before, but now you're the parent of our grandchild. Do you see? Now please notice how much weight that puts on that kid's shoulders. Because he or she will feel the weight. Nobody says anything, but they feel the weight to keep the system stable. And that's impossible for a kid to hold. So the firstborn who comes into that system will almost inevitably either become an anxious child or massively rebellious, seeking to throw hand grenades into everything all at once. If they become that, then the second one will become the caretaker of the system, right? If they're the caretaker of the system, then the second one will often become the hand grenade thrower. So if number 1 is conforming, number 2 will be rebellious. Because rebellion is now made possible by the conforming of the first. Talk about family systems sometime, it's fun. So that's the larger picture. And of course, those enmeshed systems vibrate with any real or perceived boundary violation, and that creates this tension going forward. Fear-driven systems tend to produce fear-driven children who then tend to grow up to be fear-driven adults. And you can see how this now proliferates, because we have a whole generation of people who are being parented by children. Right? We're now 3 generations past the last time we had adults parenting children in terms of that full differentiation. And exceptions, obviously, all of them in the room, but nonetheless, it's pretty fascinating. By the way, I should say, when I use the language, this generation is the most anxious generation in the history of the world, I mean this in the Western world. The 2/3 world has no time for anxiety. They're too busy dealing with real threats, like, will I have enough food to eat? That's a very different kind of dynamic. Do you see what I mean? So this anxiety is a first world problem that we need to deal, and just kind of, that helps us, by the way, that may help me to figure out where this is coming from and where it roots. The next thing is that we produce anxious children in the ways that we parent them. So if a child is parented with discipline structures that root in fear, shame, and blame, that will produce hiding and lying behaviors and emotional miscalibration. So remember Genesis 3, when we are ashamed, what do? We hide. When we are blamed, we misuse power, which is kind of common. So if I am as a parent more concerned with, and this is where I damaged my sons. So just this is where this is coming from. If we are more concerned with their public behavior than with the shape of their soul, we will use disciplinary measures often rooted in fear and shame to control behavior that then starts to anchor behavior and shame to person. Okay? So does that all make sense? Because yeah. So if we parent to control behavior, we're at Walmart and the kid's acting up, or go out for dinner or kids acting up, right? And we parent for a public perception based on perfect children, our primary weapons are going to be fear and shame as a primary way of controlling behavior. That will inevitably produce hiding and lying behavior in our children, which you can start to see how the cycle spins towards anxiety moving forward. And of course, if you're a perfectionist, as I am, recovering, but not very quickly, I'm not nearly fast enough for my perfectionism. It's like, come on, I should have this by now. Right? You will tend to parent your children towards perfection, which will paralyze them. So Jan, my oldest, one Saturday morning comes out, Daddy, I made my bed. And so he grabs me by the hand, drags me in. He's probably 4 or 5 years old. And I said, oh, Jan, this is great. Just one little twist here and it'll take that wrinkle out, it'll be perfect. And I watched his little face fall. I missed an opportunity. Do you see? And I wish I could tell you that was the only time. But because I parented out of my insecurity and fear, I really believed that that people view, because I was a pastor, right? I really believed that people had opinions about me based on how my kids behaved. Truth is, they did. Truth is, who the hell cares? But I cared because of insecurity and so on. That then influenced the way that I parented my children. And because I had a prototypical firstborn, as a firstborn, he felt that enormous pressure to conform. And you can see how that started. And then you add to that the genetic predisposition from both Judy's family and my family. And you have this perfect storm that at 16 or 17 or 18, for him it surfaced as a kid with clowns at birthday parties. And we can still remember the time we went to a birthday party with church, and the clown shows up, and Jan he wants to go back in the car, and we're saying, no, it's nothing to be afraid of. Perception is real to the perceiver, right? And it didn't occur to us, obviously, until much later, what the heck was going on, right? And so, well, you don't know. You go and play with those kids. The way you're supposed to. Have fun with a clown, because you don't get any candy if you don't. And he, okay, fine. I don't need candy. I'm not going to play the clown. Disneyland was a nightmare because all those big furry beastie things wanted to hug him, and he kicked Mickey Mouse. He kicked the Mickey Mouse. Stay away from me, you rodent. I mean, it's just this. And what was going on there, this was his anxiety starting to surface. And a 7-year-old version of a panic attack. Didn't know what was going on. But when we saw his younger brother do the same, oh, wait a minute, we've seen this before. We've seen this before.
So what do you say in that moment when the reaction of the parent, or even in just another adult who might feel like
reaction naturally seems to be there's something to be afraid of, and you're trying to help in that
Yeah.
moment. But what would the better?
Yeah, hey, it's okay. I'll go sit in the curb with you. Not a big deal. We'll get through this. What love and joy do when fear is unreasonable is give courage. You see? So as an adult, I can sit with my child and affirm his feelings because they're real to him, right? I can't deny his feelings, and the more I try, the more he doesn't trust me on anything ever. So I want to affirm his feelings, and then I want to say to him, okay, what can we do now? Right? And sometimes it's not reasonable in the moment, but then other times I can say, I'll hold your hand. I will make sure that you are not going to be hurt. Or I'll pick him up and we can, you can feel him starting to choke you. No big rush. We'll go at your pace. You got to parent the child you have, not the one you wish you had. We learn them, right? So that's the discipline structures. Anxious parents tend to produce, obviously, then anxious children. The role, how am I doing for time? Oh, good. Moms have the primary parenting role with kids between the ages of 0 and 5. Dads are vital in this period of time as well. But the primary parent, for obvious reasons initially at least, and then continue till about 5, and these are really arbitrary but not unhelpful, is to help a child learn that the world is a safe place, that it's a comfortable place, that they are going to be more or less protected, and when bad things happen, it'll still be okay. When they suffer setbacks or whatever, because kids start to leave home at about 6 months. Right? That's when they start to exercise independent identity. They start to differentiate a little bit, and they start to say no as they move into the quote-unquote terrible twos. And that's exactly what you want, right? And if you're a secure, comforting, solid parent, you can empower your child to that self-identity. If you're insecure and afraid, as I was, you will try and crush that individual expression and bring them into conformity with what your expectations of their behavior are, right? And the first one will be the experiment, and the second one will take advantage of every loophole in the whole system, right? And if you have more than 2, then the ones in the middle disappear. And then the baby, he kind of or she kind of raises him or herself. They're almost like, oh, we forgot somebody, and because you're tired. You're just tired. You raise one kid at 18, and it's like, oh crap, here they go again. Anyway, don't trust me with your children. When moms are anxious and hyperprotective of 0 to 5-year-olds, they tend to produce children who don't learn that even though they might fall over, they're still going to be okay. That if they're prohibited from falling over, if they're bubble wrapped emotionally or physically, they will tend to be anxious, right? Now take that into the next stage where mom and dad are equally partners in parenting between the ages of roughly 5 to 10, where the world now becomes a playground, where there's adventure and where real risk occurs. You could fall out of a tree. You could get bitten by an insect. You could experience things when your fort collapses in on top of you, right? And the role of parents in both sets is when bad things happen, as they inevitably will, you will be competent for what happens. You'll figure it out. You don't need me to rescue you. You might die. You might die. But you'll be okay. Sounds contradictory, but if a kid, because you watch this, if you've got little kids, is somewhere in that range. If they get hurt, if they fall off their bike or bang their face on the cement with a skateboard, or my kids drop a hammer on their brother's head, whatever it is, they will always look around to see, am I okay? Somebody let me know. Somebody let me know. And if it's in an immediate, let's call 911 and get the EMTs out here, they'll say, I think I need to cry now. I think actually the response that I'm getting indicates that I could be near death. So I think I need to panic out loud at the loudest possible volume, right? And if on the other hand, it's like, you okay? Yeah, it's kind of, the bone's jutting out, but I think I'll be all right. Do you see what I mean? And the more we try and protect, the more anxiety we produce going forward. And then in the ages between 10 and 15, dad steps in. And this is a real season of emotional vulnerability for both men and women. Dad gives to his sons and daughters the gift of their sexual identity. So there's this celebrating of the emerging manhood of his son without competition and welcome to the adult world. You will be a wonderful man, a wonderful father, a wonderful husband. You can do this. And to his daughter, you are an attractive woman. There's a sexual a celebration without sexualizing, right? A calling out of the gift of his daughter's sexual identity, same with sons, and an honoring of that, that says to her, you're not just a body, you're a person, and you will be competent as an adult. What happens is, in that stage often, is dads feel competition from their sons because their dads are insecure, and they feel threatened by the emerging femininity of their daughters. And they don't know how to, it kind of freaks them out the first time their daughter comes down the stairs looking like a young woman instead of the bunny slippers she came down for breakfast with, right? And it's like, this, and because men have a sexual stimulation that is visual, seeing a daughter and instantly the body responds. Now that can be trained, that can be calibrated, that can be honored, right? But the initial surge without the awareness that, oh no, this is okay, freaks dads out. And rather than recognize, no, this is something I have to deal with, they tend to then create distance, and especially emotional distance, from their sons and daughters at the times when emotional presence is most needed. And that obviously then produces the kinds of things that we're talking about. Any questions on any of that? Does that make sense? Okay. Then the next thing that we're dealing with, especially now, is the second stage of hyperparenting, in which a parent believes it is their job to raise the perfect child, instead of realizing that it's their job to raise an adult. Very different. So, prearranged play dates, carefully controlled and scripted play experiences. We don't just play, we have play experiences now. And we'll pay somebody to help our child play, rather than, as you will discover when you have children, if you have children you've already discovered, give them a cardboard box, they'll be fine. They know how to play, right? But this carefully controlled, carefully managed, carefully manicured, we got to get them in soccer and figure skating and dance and music and all of those, which may or may not be anything they're even remotely interested in, but are often the projection of the parents' lost childhood or desires or whatever else flows into that. And that uber involved, you've heard the term helicopter parents, prevents the child as they move into adulthood from experiencing any harm any disappointment. You got bullied on the playground? I want that name. I want that name right now. What is that child's mother's name? I'm going to call that child's mother right now. We are going to have this out. Nobody is going to bully my child on the playground. Rather than saying, well, how do you plan to deal with that tomorrow? I think you're competent for this. Now, there are times when you want to say to a teacher, you want to say to a staff member, can you please keep an eye on this? I don't want to get involved because there are some toxic kids out there, right? But the more we try and protect our kids from all and everything, the more they learn that they're not competent for anything. Listener, you had a...
So I have a kid that is a product of that, like hardcore in my classroom right now, and I would love to hear a possible strategy or two and how to walk with her in that, and figuring out that she doesn't have to be like this like huge mess all the time. She can constantly walk through life successfully.
Yeah, it's going to be real challenging. So the first thing she's got to know is that you love her and care for her. It's challenging as a school teacher. As a pastor, it's a lot easier. But then the second thing is you probably, how old is your kid? Yeah, okay, perfect. So you can, at some point, if you win the right to say this, let her know that she's probably the only adult in her household.
We've talked about that.
Good. And that therefore, let's learn how an adult handles this kind of stuff. So you may be the voice that says, no, girlie, you can actually do this. Here's a script that might be helpful. And you're going to get this wrong. You're probably going to punch somebody in the face that you don't want, but that's all right. We'll get through that, and so will they. You'll go down, and I'll visit you in prison. It'll be okay. No, so that there is a sense that an adult believes that she's competent as an adult, because that's the gift that's supposed to be given, right, on their way out the door, and often isn't. Okay, and the hyper-parenting is, we had this year, for the first time, I shouldn't say this on camera, but oh well, because we're dealing with the university. FERPA laws prohibit us from discussing anything about a child's progress academically. After 18, they're viewed from the education standpoint as an adult. But for this year, we had a freshman whose mother walked around with him on the first day of class to find and wanted to go in all the academic advising appointments and make sure that, and then I saw another one a couple of days ago, and it's like, this is an epidemic. It's drone parenting. I don't know. Those of you in higher education, are you guys dealing with this? It's the craziest thing. And so we ended up saying to this child, we are prohibited by law from discussing your grades with your parent unless you sign a written waiver that you will permit us to do that. And within the next week, that child was withdrawn from school. I bet you can tell, no slur, where that child went to school from 0 to 18. Brilliant kid. I mean, off the charts SATs. But no capacity. I mean, in our universities, it's 2,000 kids. You can get lost and found in 30 seconds. It's not challenging. you know what I mean? So this failure to trust her with her life, and you know what's inevitably going to happen. I'm dealing with another one right now that you're 22, you've graduated from college. Of course, she'll move home. No, I want to marry the boy that he's from the devil, quote. We know that, because it really gets weird when you got Christian parents, because they spiritualize all the crazy. Do you know? It gets weird. So hyperparenting, And then the controlling perfectionism, we talked a little bit about that. And then the final one is this: children who at varying developmental stages suffer significant trauma, emotionally particularly, that pushes them into survivor structures. And then survivors are a whole breed that spend much of their life figuring how to minimize any and all circumstances that would produce anxiety. So that's good for tonight. Anybody have any questions or thoughts on comments you want to make, things you want to push into, clarifications that we should think about? Yes, sir.
How do you deal with, like, let's say you're in a work environment and the process of, like, let's say like I would work in front of a computer, and then during that time I would be anxious because of the workspace, or the people I'm working with, my coworkers, would create anxiety around there, and therefore anytime I would go and sit there, nothing's going on, but I feel this sense of anxiety.
Yeah. So, that's not uncommon because you do have anxious workplaces. There's a whole phenomenon on that now. A lot of friendships are rooted in drama. I was sitting with somebody at lunch yesterday, and it occurred to him finally, after 2.5 years of walking with him, that I'm the guy with the hand grenades. Every relationship I've ever been in, I've blown up in one way or another because I need the drama to feel needed. I need the crazy, I need the chaos, right? So he's the carrier. Oh, okay, now let's put the hand grenades down and move on. So part of that, it may be having adult conversations with coworkers and saying this doesn't need to be a crazy-making workspace. But that assumes a certain level of adult possibility of that conversation with coworkers, and it may not be possible. They may not be able to function for a while as adults. So you may have to set the tone by non-anxious presence, by the ways that you respond to stuff.
So if the space itself creates anxiety, whereas it's not like there's nothing going on, it's just
the way
like,
the way the room's set up,
yeah,
you mean?
Yeah, the room, or like I'm walking into this room like, oh, it's just giving me anxiety, and maybe it could be because of traumatic experiences, or it could be because, like,
Okay, I misunderstood. It would be worthwhile thinking through what it is about the room that is distressing to you. So like that gray panel back there is about 1.5 inches off, and it's driving me nuts. And that one over there, right by Chris, is the same way, right? And it's just like, now I know what's going on, and I know my OCD. I know, it'll be okay. And after everybody's gone, I will go straighten them out. But I think part of it then is to be aware of what that is. And then for you, wisdom, probably the spiritual discipline of saying, I don't need everything to be perfect, but it's okay for me to need a couple of things to be in line. And then order your desk or the workspace or the environment, maybe turn it in some ways that could be helpful. Might be a way to mitigate until you've centered down enough that the space isn't anxious. Another one that I hadn't wanted to talk too much about, but that you need to probably be aware of without any knowledge of your workspace, is spiritual warfare. It's real, and we need to have an awareness, not freaking out, just stuff under every blade of grass, but an awareness that is a thing, and therefore we can pray into protection in spaces like that. My son just moved into an apartment, and he said, I don't know what it is, Dad, but it just feels weird. Okay, let's anoint the place and dedicate it in the name of Jesus and establish appropriate authority here. And he did that, and we're, okay, done.
Okay, so it is possible to create, like, if a space does used to create an environment of anxiety, it is possible to turn that around and create that space of
Mhm.
something more positive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, I'll hang around for a few minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, you mentioned how when you don't deal with grief the first time, and
Yeah.
then something triggers it small, and then it's brought up all again, how would you, like, lead someone into dealing with the second or third, the next time around?
Yeah. So often what will happen is a husband or a wife of 25 or 30 or 40 years passes away, and because of who knows why, they don't really deal with it, and then 6 months later the dog dies. And then they're just in massive depression and you realize, okay, the dog was cute, but it's probably not that. Well, what's happening is the stuff that never got dealt with here. So you honor that grief and you walk with them probably for close to a year to work through, okay, where are you feeling this? What is the loss that you're really experiencing here? And give them permission to feel because they start to shame themselves for feeling that grief at the death of the dog when they were so brave and courageous at the death of a husband or wife or whatever. And so follow the shame trail because it will inevitably lead you back to the place. So you have to legitimize, no, grief in any of its forms. Let's let this work itself through the system and give them some space on that.
What if you've never been taught how to deal with grief?
Yeah.
Say you're brought up in a family that you're not allowed to show emotions.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to have an opinion because it's a form of disrespect.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't know how to handle
Yeah.
different things.
Yeah.
Like, I don't get angry. I don't
Yeah.
push it, but you want it now. I'll cry, but I won't get angry.
Yeah.
So how do you really go through all these processes of grief? How do you really know how?
Yeah. And that's why we're built for community, right? So that when you are in a community group or whatever and have experienced something, your rest of your team can say, this is weird. What's really going on here? And then sometimes just say, it's okay to feel what you're feeling. Emotions, remember, are not to be evaluated. They need to be calibrated, but they can't be dismissed. And so when we do that, then that can often legitimize, and then you may discover, oh, really, I am angry. And that's okay too. Now I need to learn how. Yeah. Okay, let's pray and then you can go and be anxious.